everybody. I'm Fred Rutberg. I'm proud to be the president of the Berkshire Eagle, and I'm overwhelmed by this crowd. I'm delighted to be on the stage of the Tina Packer Playhouse in front of a packed audience in front of the set for Hamlet. Masked ICE agents patrol parking lots, disappear people at gunpoint. The federal government is telling parents to reduce the number of vaccinations they're giving their kids while measles is making a terrific comeback. Last year, the president received $2 billion. And that didn't include the $400 million airplane. So it's easy to muse in this situation, in this context, that something is rotten in America. Tonight's topic, a republic, can we save it? Seems eerily appropriate, but fortunately our speakers are particularly well equipped to discuss this. Their bios are in the program, and that's why you're all here, because you knew them before you got here. But there was an editorial mistake that's totally my fault. We left out the bio for our moderator, Don Morrison. Now, most of you know Don because you read his column every Friday. But he's also been a member of the advisory board of the Berkshire Eagle since we started it, and he's the co-chair. He's written for every magazine you can think about. He's been editor of Time magazine, and he's written several books. There will be a Q&A after when the conversation comes to an end. That's why you got cards and pencils when you came in. So write down your questions. You didn't? Some did. The lucky people did. Well, I apologize. Everybody was supposed to get one. That's the way it works. Okay, Eagle people are walking around now, spreading joy in the audience. So please write your questions down. Understand that brevity and good penmanship will be rewarded. And we'll pass those questions on to our moderator, who will ask as many as time allows. And this event marks the official opening or launch of our 5th annual drive for the Local Journalism Fund. Now, the Local Journalism Fund is something the Eagle created in partnership with the Berkshire-Taconic Community Foundation. It supports reporting in 4 substantive areas: education, health, economic development, and arts and culture. Those are consistent with the charitable purposes of Berkshire-Taconic. There will be no solicitation tonight, but you'll hear from me in a couple of days. I hope you can be as generous this year as you have in the past. Now, I hope you all look at the LJF and think it's your favorite charity, but I know it's not. Most, if not many of you, many if not most of you, I should say, have pet charities. And I'd like to suggest that if you do have other interests, that supporting independent local journalism should always be number 2 on your list, because we shine a light on all the other things that you do, all the other good causes that you support. So we are, in effect, a force multiplier for all the good causes in the Berkshires. And think about that when you hear from me. I want to say thank you to Shakespeare and Company for letting us use this wonderful space, and Alan Burrows, its executive director, our artistic director, and Steve Ball, the general manager. Also want to say thank you to CTSB. We're taping this, recording it to be shown throughout Southern Berkshire in a few days. And most important, I also want to thank all the Eagle people that are floating around here. They've made putting on this event seamless and wonderful. They really deserve your thanks. Finally, and most important, I want to thank the participants in this event. It really is They've been very, very generous with their time, and I know you're going to learn a lot and have a great evening. So without further ado, A Republic, Can We Save It? Catherine Rampell, Paul Krugman, moderated by Don Morrison. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming. I'm not going to go over the biographies of our distinguished guests because you can read those. I just want to add a few little interesting tidbits that is it on? There we go. Okay. I didn't know that Catherine was born and raised in South Florida, where, looking at this audience, I assume about half of you spend the winter. Nor did I know that when Paul Krugman won the Nobel Prize in 2008 for his groundbreaking efforts on the subjects of trade and tariffs, the story in the New York Times the next day on the front page was written by, guess who? Catherine Rampell.
My first front page story, actually.
Bless you. So anyway, this little trio up here has a lot in common. I never got the Nobel Prize, of course, because they don't give it in journalism, but if they did. But all of us have ties to the Berkshires that we love very much. Paul, I think, was born in the Berkshire suburb of Albany, New York. I too, like Fred said, I'm enormously grateful to you for being here. And I would guess that because you read the Berkshire Eagle, you also read lots of other things as well. And you could not have helped but notice that we live in interesting times. I can't think of any period in the country's 250-year history when, except perhaps around the time of the Civil War, but even then things are different and even scarier in some respects now. A rising tide of partisan strife, technology that promises to shape and reshape our economy for better or worse, the way we and our children and future generations will think for better or for worse, and indeed our democracy, most likely for worse. At the same time, we're in a war that is dragging on far longer than it was supposed to have. That war has created enormous dislocations for our economy. It has divided the country even more on its own. So America's in a tough spot right now. So I want to ask you guys, how do we get here? Paul?
Okay. Okay. Well, I'm a lot older than Catherine, and I think there's still a tendency of a lot of people to think that, well, we were a kind of normal, more or less healthy democracy until Donald Trump came down that escalator in 2016. And that is not at all true. This has been building for a very, very long time. I was actually in the Reagan administration. It's complicated, sub-political level, but I actually spent a year. And let me tell you, in 1982, 1983, there were already a lot of really crazy people in the government, and there was already, more important, there was a increasingly radicalized right-wing movement that was gaining power. So we were already very much on the path to where we are now 40 plus years ago. There was I think in this audience people do remember, though a lot of people would not remember the shock when Newt Gingrich became Speaker of the House. He was unthinkably right-wing radical based on anything previous. So this has been building for a very long time. I think at some level, this was bound to happen. We were bound to find ourselves in the current place, and that's what it is. This is not. If you talk about we're a polarized, divided country, that's getting the story wrong. It makes it seem as if it's like both sides and everybody's gone crazy. But what's not? It's that there's a radical movement which has gained an enormous amount of power in America.
Catherine, what's your take on that?
So maybe this is reflective of, different generations, but I would date a lot of the problems we have right now to the 2007-2008 financial crisis. I think it fundamentally broke whatever trust there was left between the public and many of our institutions, our political institutions, our financial institutions, our journalistic institutions. There had been sort of a downward secular trend before that, but that was when things really broke, in my view. And actually, there's been some research finding a linkage between financial crises and the rise of populist movements, particularly right-wing populist movements, but right and left. The right-wing version tends to do a little better. Usually, from what I remember of this paper, I don't know if Paul remembers the paper that I'm referring to, but I think it's like a 10-year process, something along those lines. On average, we are past that at this point, unfortunately. But normally there is a phase where people look for a scapegoat because everything just feels like it's not working anymore. The institutions have let us down. And I think there is a hunger for some kind of easy scapegoat or set of magic bullets. And sometimes it takes more violent forms, and sometimes it takes less violent forms. But I think it dates to that. Then I would layer on top of that the splintering of the media environment, which is a technological evolution that reinforces a lot of this distrust of authority figures, of experts, of institutions, because one way you succeed in the current media environment is by saying, I'm the lone prophet who will tell you the truth, and everybody else is lying to you. And so you shouldn't trust the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and all of the legacy institutions. I say this even though we are both writing now on Substack, which of course thrives in this environment. But that's part of what happens here. That there is a heightened distrust, and then the monetization of that distrust, and the exploitation of that distrust by political actors who use that moment, that burgeoning distrust, to try to get their agenda through, which often involves scapegoating a particular population in order to tell everyone that you're going to solve their problems. That's how I see it.
This sounds like an old story in the U.S., scapegoating an underrepresented, underpowered minority. Is this really new? What about it is new?
I mean, if we really wanted to go to deep roots, it's talking about scapegoating and all of that. It would be, it was the passage of the Civil Rights Act. In a lot of ways, this ball started rolling 60 plus years ago because of that. And yes, this has always happened, the dark side has always been there in American politics, as it is everywhere. I mean, if you ask, what is the share of MAGA-like voters around the Western world? It's about 30 to 35% of voters everywhere. There's a comparable number of people on that who share those proclivities. I hate the term populist because the idea that Donald Trump with his billion-dollar profiteering is a populist, but anyway, but this kind of movement has similar levels of support in all Western countries. It's just that in the United States, a combination of the nature of our political institutions, the way that money plays a bigger role in our politics than anybody else's, and so on, has brought that movement to power in a way that hasn't happened anyplace else. But if you ask, what is it about Americans that makes us susceptible to this stuff? Well, we're really no different from the French or the Germans or even the Danes or the Dutch. So that's how it goes.
Louder, please.
What?
Louder.
Sorry. Yes. We're doomed. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, it is true that there has been this rise of, I would call them right-wing populists, but whatever euphemism you want to use, has been the case in Germany, in France, and all of these other countries. I would say that it matters more here in the United States because we have bigger weapons, both the literal kinds of weapons and institutional kinds of weapons, and there's a lot more that we can destroy internally and externally than no shade to the Germans or to the French or others, but it's when our president throws a tantrum, if we put in place someone who is going to throw a tantrum, it has much bigger global ramifications than if that's the case in some other country where there's a right-wing party that's rising to power.
Yeah, part of it, I think we had some. I'll try. We had some. It was funny because I think we had a period when we thought maybe the fever was cooling. The election of Barack Obama made a lot of people were feeling, not even if you didn't necessarily support him, were kind of feeling good about America. Hey, we can elect a black president, and we had somebody who, it sounded like a president, and a lot of professionalism, but it wasn't nearly as deep as people thought it was, and it turned out that really had not changed the underlying dynamics of our dissent. And the financial crisis, it is. I mean, I agree that was a tremendous watershed. It wasn't quite the watershed we thought it was going to be, or at least I thought it was going to be. I was thinking Obama will be the new FDR. It wasn't quite as bad as the Great Depression, but it was pretty bad, and that the response would be reform, would be sort of some genuine populism, and instead we got the Tea Party.
Yeah, I mean, you could make the same argument about COVID. COVID could have been an opportunity to unite the country against this external, abstract enemy, and of course, it had the exact opposite consequence. But I remember talking with political scientists early in COVID about their hopes that this was such a divided, polarized country, and now finally we had the scapegoat that we could all unite to defeat, and instead, obviously, the opposite happened.
Yeah, one of my more fun, a lot of people didn't quite get the joke, but during the aftermath of the financial crisis, when what we really, really needed was sort of a New Deal type, we needed fiscal stimulus, we needed infrastructure spending, but I was suggesting that we ought to invent a fake threat from aliens, because that would unite the country behind the kind of spending that we really needed for economic recovery.
But actually, when COVID struck, I remember talking to political scientists who basically said, short of having an alien invasion, it's hard to imagine another circumstance that could potentially be more fruitful in, weaving back together the social fabric, which just sounds so naive and quaint, obviously.
Well, there are people in the U.S. who say we are enduring an alien infestation.
Yeah, I'm one of them. I think that some of these right-wingers are they're barely part of my species. Anyway, sorry.
No, I mean, I think you're not supposed to do in a public forum like this is mention the N-word, Nazism. Are we going through what the world went through in the 1930s?
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually did stick in this morning's Substack. I put Führerprinzip, the leader principle, into the Substack and said, I think it's okay to use the German now. I mean, there's a lot of similarity, and in particular, actually, if we look at the grotesqueries that are happening right now with the cult of personality, that is very much something. It's wildly un-American, at least by my notion of what America is about. But that is definitely has that feeling. Although one thing that you would say, we're not fully. History. Apparently, Mark Twain never actually said it, but still, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, and it's not all the same. Among other things, there were more actually competent people in the Nazi Party, and Hitler didn't destroy the effectiveness of his military.
Oh, so we're actually better off than the Nazis were.
Well, in a way, the sort of haplessness of this administration may be our saving grace.
You don't think that it's going to improve our military lethality if we redesign all of our naval warships so that they... this is a real thing that the Washington Post recently wrote about. Look it up. Trump wants to redesign our naval warships so that they look prettier. They look more like World War II era battleships, I believe.
He doesn't
That's
like
what he wants.
where the command tower is on our aircraft carriers. He wants it moved forward. Sorry, yeah, okay, this one's a little bit, I keep on forgetting that it's a little sensitive here. But yeah, he wants to move the command tower forward because that's where it was on World War II aircraft carriers. He also wants to build Trump-class battleships, which is, if there's one thing, we're just seeing the world's greatest military humiliated by drones, and we're going to build giant sitting ducks.
Yeah.
But there we go.
Yeah, no, we're optimizing for the wrong things, is maybe how I would put it. I go back and forth about the Nazi comparison. There's this idea called Godwin's Law. Have you all heard of it? Which is named after this guy Godwin. I forget what his deal is. Do you know what his background is?
I don't know. And the original Godwin's Law was not what we now mean by it. But anyway.
But the idea is that, like, any internet argument will inevitably reach a point where somebody gets called a Nazi. Right? And that this is just like so reductive, and it's the trump card that everybody always wants to play, no pun intended, because the Nazis are bad. I think what's interesting today is that even though you would think all of us would agree you don't want to be on the side of the Nazis, that's no longer taken for granted. There have been times when the president has expressed admiration for various authoritarian figures, including Adolf Hitler. He made some comment recently, right, where he said, like, somebody told him that he was the most powerful man in history alongside Stalin, Mao, I think Hitler, and a lot of other great company you want to be in, clearly. Like I said, I go back and forth about whether the actual comparison is overblown. I think a more useful thought experiment is something like, people always ask, what would I have done in that era had I faced these conditions requiring society, asking regular members of society to do horrible, horrible things? And I think the answer is, whatever you're doing now is what you would have done then. And we are taking some of the rhetorical playbook, whether it's deliberate or not, whether it's actually quoting from the speeches of Hitler. There's this maybe apocryphal story that Trump used to keep the speeches of Hitler on the side of his bed. Who knows if that's actually true.
I don't believe, because I don't believe he reads.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I think that's giving him a little too much credit. I think some of these things are just like tried and true rhetorical tropes that every strong man finds themselves gravitating to, and probably they think that they have uniquely discovered. But whatever the motivation behind all of this, whatever the rhetorical origin behind all of this, we're doing some of the same stuff. We're creating concentration camps effectively right now. If you read any of the coverage of the conditions in those camps, I don't know that it's a whole lot better than like a Theresienstadt or someplace like that. They're not death camps, thank God. They're not deliberately death camps, but people are dying. The conditions are really horrible. And there are a lot of people colluding with those who are creating these conditions. It's Paul's comment about the haplessness is mostly true, except I think in the immigration regime. I think actually Stephen Miller is so dangerous because he is very smart and he actually understands how to weaponize the immigration system against, again, this preferred scapegoat. And there are a lot of politicians who are looking the other way. There are a lot of politicians who convince themselves that it's not really that bad. And again, like, what would they have done in the 30s and the 40s? Well, you're seeing it now.
One thing that we know now. One thing we do know now is how essential immigrants are to the U.S. economy. And we're starting to see a lot of dislocation as a result of the mass deportations.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. For a president who says he hates illegal immigrants, he is responsible for the greatest mass illegalization events in history. He has unilaterally turned I think at this point, definitely hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of people who had been documented into undocumented immigrants. So it's not only the deportations, it's also that there are a lot of people who are here who were here legally, who had work permits. For example, there are a lot of Haitian immigrants who had something called temporary protected status, which allowed them to work in a lot of fields that Americans don't want to work in, including as home healthcare aides and other caregiving positions that are really hard, backbreaking work. They've all been de-documented. And you will see huge problems, I think. It hasn't been as visible as I thought it was going to be a year ago, but I think it's going to become more visible this year. You will see big dislocations throughout the country. The Journal, I think, had a good story today about a bunch of nursing homes in Florida that are now scrambling. That's an industry where there are already chronic labor shortages, and now, again, all of these legal workers are no longer legal workers, and they had to be let go. Who's going to take care of... We're all good. We're all good. No harm, no foul. In any event, I think you are going to see some major problems, particularly in certain industries. I mean, immigrants, as Paul can tell you, are both consumers and workers. And so when you lose immigrants from this country, if they are deported, not just de-documented and stay here in the shadows, then they're going to stop buying stuff too. And the question is, does that lead to how does that affect the economy on net? Right? Is it inflationary or disinflationary or what have you? But I think in certain industries, agriculture, home health care aides, construction, I think it's going to be a huge, huge problem.
Yeah, if I can talk a little bit of economics here. One of the big discoveries of labor economics in the 1990s. So this is totally not the kind of thing you really want to hear about. There was a real revolution in a good way in the field of economics, in labor economics, that was much less theorizing, more actual data. Just had much more the empirical revolution. And one of the big discoveries of that revolution was that people used to think, even I used to think, that, well, immigrants without a high school education, say, without a high school degree, were competing with native-born workers with similar levels of formal education, that non-college immigrants were competing with, again. And it turns out that immigrants are very different. They have different sets of skills, because if you think that skill is only what comes with a BA or a PhD, obviously there's a lot more. They have very different willingness to work in jobs that are often, emptying bedpans or picking fruit. So it turns out that immigrants are overwhelmingly complements, not substitutes, for native-born workers, which was a reason to say, look, the impact of immigration is positive for the great majority of even the native-born. I don't think anyone really anticipated that we would be running that experiment in reverse at the speed with which we're now doing it, but it is really major. And one of the things that struck me, just I was looking at the other day, is that construction workers, it's something like 28% of construction workers in the U.S. are foreign-born. How many are documented? Not we don't know, but it's more like 60% of the front of the people laying bricks and spreading plaster. And so there's a lot of native-born workers in the office, a lot of native-born workers doing the sort of less physical, if you like, parts of construction, but the actual putting stuff up is overwhelming the people. And how many are undocumented? Quite a lot. And in any case, would you like to be a brown-skinned Spanish-speaking person on a construction site, even if you are in fact fully legal? So this is this is going to hit quite hard, and we're starting to see it.
Yeah, actually, there's a lawsuit that the Institute for Justice, which is like a libertarian civil liberties organization, I would say, has filed on behalf of an American citizen who has been detained 3 times on construction sites. And every time, he's like, I'm an American citizen, and I don't think they literally say, but you're brown and speak Spanish, but that is effectively what happens, and they keep detaining him, and so he's been suing. What's been interesting to me about all of this is that lawsuit I just mentioned, it is filed by the worker himself. It is not filed by any of the firms the construction companies that are also caught up in this. And it's not just the construction industry, it's basically every industry, for the most part, has been very timid about pushing back against the administration because they don't want to put a target on their back. Even the industry groups, the Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce, who I would have guessed exist precisely for occasions like this, where they can speak on behalf of the interests of the industry without any one member, any one company having to stick their neck out. They have been very timid, and it's been disappointing, to say the least. I mean, I guess I understand the incentives that they face. Nobody wants to be the first mover, but whenever I talk with the titans of industry types or these industry groups, what they say is, when I say, like, well, why don't you speak up? This is bad for you. I'm not even making the moral argument about why you should care about rule of law. Like, it's bad for you if this president is shaking you down, right? Or shaking down your members and sweeping up your workers and otherwise, and abusing your customers or whatever. Like, there are a lot of selfish reasons why I would have guessed that you would see more intervention from the private sector. And they basically all say, well, you know, it's really up to the voters. They need to do something. And as long as we can, like, have some kind of relationship with the administration, it's hard for us to be willing to sacrifice that, right? They want to make their transactional deals basically quietly without embarrassing the administration, and they know that they would destroy their relationships if they came forward and spoke up. And the question is always, well, what's the red line at which you would speak up? And that red line keeps shifting.
Speaking of speaking up, now you can hear me. But also, before we leave the subject of immigration, many of us have in-laws, relatives, people who work for us who are absolutely terrified, people who are in the U.S. legally. Is this going to start affecting things like payment of taxes, declaration of income, responses to census questions, all the interactions that Americans have directly with government agencies? Some of these numbers are going to be wonky, and some of the revenue flows are going to dry up because certain people in the United States are terrified to stick their heads up.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's so just to say that the terror is, as we know from all too many stories now, that being even if you're fully legitimate, it's not a guarantee. I mean, I not to reveal too much, but I have a relative married into the family who is Dominican, and Dominican Harvard MBA, but brown skin, and speaks Spanish with her family, and never goes anywhere without her passport card, even knowing that even that might not be enough. But that's the America we're now living in. It's certainly going to affect the information we were talking about. I mean, I just been writing a little bit, and I've been using some of the Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates on foreign-born workforce in the full understanding that those data are extremely unreliable now. Because if you were a brown-skinned Spanish-speaking person, would you talk to the survey taker? But it's also, I think, and this maybe takes us a bit beyond immigration. When you talk about paying taxes, one thing that I don't think is on many people's radar right now is that not only do we have the problem that people who are undocumented or fear that they might be mistaken for undocumented are going to be not willing to pay taxes and fill out the forms, but just in general, one of the things that has always distinguished America among advanced countries is that we have a law-abiding tax culture, that we're one of the countries where people do pay their income tax. There's just, relatively speaking, compared with most of Europe, we don't do a whole lot of cheating because it was kind of understood that we didn't do that. It was kind of a collective norm. And between the immigration stuff, but also just the fact that everybody is cheating in public life, what's going to happen to all of that?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So I've written a lot about attacks on our statistical agencies and data collection and things like that, and there is definitely an intersection with the immigration stuff. There's a lot of other stuff happening there, censorship and purging of data and things like that that are not related to immigration, but just in the case of taxes. So immigrants are actually a great fiscal investment for the United States because they pay, historically, they pay into the system, but they cannot actually get much money out of the system, even those who are here legally, because there are a lot of restrictions on ability to access various kinds of federal social safety net programs, but especially those who are undocumented because they're paying into the Social Security system, let's say, but they are never going to be entitled to draw out of it. And the IRS historically went on like these big public relations campaigns where they would assure the immigrant community that if you pay your taxes legally, we are not going to share that data with the immigration authorities. And pay your taxes, and actually there's this whole like parallel system. If you don't have a social security number, ITIN number, I forget what it stands for. Somebody here probably works in accounting and knows. But in any event, the idea was that there was a way to legally pay your taxes. They wanted to maximize tax compliance, tax morale, without people being afraid of that information being weaponized against them. What is one of the very first things that this president did when he got into office? He tried to have the Treasury Department, under which IRS sits, sign a memorandum of understanding of some kind with DHS to share that data. And there's been a bunch of lawsuits over this, and I think at this point they're still prohibited from sharing the data, but the damage is already done. If you were someone, you're a construction worker, or you work in food services or whatever, and you were paying your taxes legally, why on earth would you ever interact with a system now that would use that against you? So that's just one way that there's been sort of a chilling effect, and that is likely to result in lower tax revenues being collected. Then you have other efforts to undermine the statistical agencies. So just as an example, folks may remember that in the first Trump administration, there was an effort to put a citizenship question on the decennial census, and the Supreme Court struck it down. Now, they didn't strike it down because they said, like, on the merits, this is a bad idea, you shouldn't put it on the census. The census can get updated with additional questions. That happens periodically. Basically, they said that, like, they cut too many corners and they didn't follow some administrative procedures that they were supposed to do. Fast forward to today. They learned. We have another decennial census coming up in 2030. They are planning really, really early to try to undermine it as early as possible. One of the things that they're doing that I wrote about recently that is likely to come out officially pretty soon is they're trying to change the definition of who actually lives in this country. Right now, if you are an immigrant who lives in this country, you are counted as part of the population per the Constitution. The Constitution says that it is supposed to enumerate all persons, not all citizens, all persons. They are trying to change it so that if you are not a citizen, you are no longer counted as a resident. So that means if you are a skilled worker on a work visa, if you're a refugee, anything basically short of a citizenship, naturalized citizen, maybe a green card, you will no longer be counted as living in this country, which will have big consequences for, well, participation in the census, but also who gets congressional representation, where money flows. All of that is based on who lives in this country, not just who is a citizen of this country. So there are like a bunch of little technical things that they're doing too, in addition to the Gothic horrors of, you know, sweeping people off of the streets and disappearing them into vans and taking them to these concentration camps. There are a lot of other more technical things that don't get as much attention that will also do quite a lot of damage to our institutions. Again, to where taxpayer dollars flow, to who gets a congressional representation, and then basically all of the other data sets that exist in this country, even the private ones, they rely on the census to calibrate it. So if that gets screwed up, which is the plan, that's going to screw up our unemployment numbers. It's going to screw up like how Walmart decides where to locate businesses, all sorts of things. Again, these are reasons why the private sector should also be speaking up, because even if their objections are not necessarily based in like moral values, it's gonna make the business environment a lot harder to thrive in. There's a reason why the United States has traditionally been a good place to do business, and it's because we have rule of law and good institutions and freedom of capital flows and freedom of labor flows and things like that, and all of that's getting destroyed too.
By the way, let me say something that is one thing not to be cynical about, at least not yet. So one question I get all the time is, given who's in charge, why should I believe any of the numbers that are coming out of the government? Why should I believe the unemployment number or the inflation number? And the answer is not that they wouldn't cook the books if they could, but there's a lot more going on in producing these numbers than most people realize. This is not some Trump appointee penciling in a number. This is a process that involves thousands of professionals. And will they corrupt it? Possibly, but we would know. We would hear about it. Catherine would hear about it. I would get it. We would get it. So far, now there are other problems with those. So we have a general problem, which long predates Trump, of diminishing resources, inadequate effort being put into finding out just what the hell is going on in this country. But that is one of the things that you should not be worried about just yet. It's when we get jobs increased by 80,000 or they fell by 23,000, that is still professionals doing the best they can.
Yeah, although my one caveat to that is that while they can't deliberately cook the books, they are taking away resources from a lot of these agencies, so that maybe they're going to be noisier because, as we've been talking about, there are a lot of reasons why people may not answer the phone when a surveyor calls. Maybe it's because you're an immigrant. Maybe it's because, I get spam calls all the time. I don't answer my phone. Probably the audience out here, same thing. So it is actually much more resource intensive to get information like, are you working or not, in the unemployment number, for example. And we are laying off the workers, or at least giving them early retirement, shall we say. And so a lot of the numbers are getting, I think, worse, but not necessarily in an obvious direction. They're just getting worse because they're noisier. And that's also a deliberate campaign. I think, some of this is about just making it hard. Some of it is about cooking the books in a particular direction. And I think some of it, again, is just about sowing distrust so that people do not know how to trust, what to trust, when to trust particular sources of information, whether it comes from the government, whether it comes from the media, whether it comes from experts or academics at a particular institution. And I think a populace is just much more susceptible to sort of authoritarian or fascist leaders if there is no common agreement on what the facts are. And if it's much harder to hold politicians to account because you can't tell what's real and what's not.
Speaking of cutting resources, current administration, as you know, has been reducing not only personnel in almost every major agency in the country, but also funds for things like research. It's going to save us enormous amounts of money, I'm sure. But are we robbing ourselves to pay the Treasury?
Oh, it's much worse than you're implying. The U.S. There's one thing that you would have said about the United States 2 years ago is one of the things we were still overwhelmingly the center for science in the world. The United States, partly because of funding, partly because of the openness of our system, the sort of openness to people, openness to ideas. Actually, just quickly, I get two kinds of fun letters about immigration from people. One is people who live somewhere. I do get letters occasionally saying, "How would you feel if New York was full of immigrants?" And the other
horror of horrors. Yeah.
And the other is, "How would you feel if lots of professors' jobs were going to immigrants?" And if you've ever been in any first-rate department, or even any college department anywhere in America, wow. But the point is that whole thing is under incredible attack. There's been a giant cut in funding, but on top of that, there's trying to politicize the entire process of support. That grants are now being, as we speak, they're now being screened. The granting, actually, even the funding that's available is often not being handed out because they've frozen lots of grants. And they're trying to basically say that if a grant, either it's DEI somehow, or that it's we have reason to believe that the lead researcher on this has said something critical about President Trump. That's massively underway, and that just destroys the whole edifice of U.S. science. I mean, there's tremendous inertia behind that. So much science is done in America that it's really hard to undermine it, but the drasticness of what's happening may mean that really America as a leading scientific nation may be gone in a couple of years.
Yeah, it's really striking. We are slaughtering the golden goose. Basically, science and technology are the sector that have given us a leg up economically for over 100 years at this point. And it is how we have the internet, for example, through various kinds of government investment in research, whether within the government or planting seed funding within academia. This is how we have thrived as a country, as an economy, is through science and technology and research. And we are destroying it not only by defunding various grants. It's also comes back to immigration. We have basically made it impossible to get a STEM-related PhD in this country. They just changed the way that the student visas work so that they can only last 4 years. If any of you have a PhD or have kids who are in grad school, you know that the typical PhD in STEM takes like 5 or 6 plus years. So we're basically throwing those students out, people who would otherwise probably try to stay here, get jobs here, start companies here. So we are throwing out talent. And, we were talking earlier, or Paul was talking earlier, about how the skills of immigrants are complementary to those of native-born workers. That's actually true not only in what we might think of as, I know this sounds pejorative, but like the lower skilled occupations, like construction or food services or whatnot, including in the higher educational attainment ones. There's been a bunch of good research, including by this professor at NYU named Petra Moser, about what the consequences were of the Quota Acts from the 1920s, which were the previous round of restrictionist immigration policy that Stephen Miller wants to go back to. Although I will point out that was done through Congress, not through a president acting unilaterally. So at least there was some constitutional legitimacy to it, I guess, but it was still bad policy. That research found that the Quota Acts were disproportionately trying to keep out immigrants from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. And you can see the scientists who were, like those countries tended to produce scientists who were better in certain fields. I forget what they were. And the scientists who came through from like Western Europe were still allowed to come in. And you can look at what happened to patents filed in the United States after the Quota Acts when we shut off this pipeline of talent from these parts of the world that, again, disproportionately produced experts in certain scientific fields. And you can see that the United States became much less cutting edge, much less good at those areas of scientific inquiry. And one of the main avenue why was because those immigrants would co-author and collaborate with American-born scientists. And it was that the immigrants made American-born scientists more productive. So again, it was complementary. Even though they were doing the same job, they might be in the same occupation, as Paul points out. Like I'm married to an economics professor, go to his department. He's one of the few, native-born Americans who's there. A lot of immigrants there, but they co-author with the native, the immigrants co-author with the native-born immigrant or the native-born Americans, and this is true in the hard sciences as well. So when we are keeping out all of this talent, in addition to defunding the research itself, we are cutting off this pipeline of cutting-edge research, and that's hurting not only the immigrants who might be able to contribute, but to the Americans who they might have been working with and building companies with.
On the other hand, if there is another hand, there's been a constant strain of discourse in the U.S. for decades now that the federal government is too big, too intrusive. It's supervised by fellow bureaucrats who let their colleagues get away with a lot of things they shouldn't. It spends too much money. It's inefficient. It does things that in many cases should be left to the private sector. And that it was due for a haircut.
Oh, wow. There's a no. There particularly. I mean, it's funny. If you wanted to make that case, you probably would try to do it for state and local governments. Even there, I don't think it's true. But there's a line which is often misattributed to me, but I actually stole it from somebody else. But that the federal government of the United States is an insurance company with an army. It's an insurance company with an army. Where does the federal government spend its money? It's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and Defense. I refuse to call it the Department of War. And that's where the money goes. And there's almost it's not the federal workforce is not that big relative to the size of the country, and not that big relative to what it used to be. There's not a lot of the salaries of federal workers are quite a small part of the budget. Overwhelmingly, it's paying for retirement, health bills, and the idea that there is a huge wasteful bureaucracy is just not right. And then if you spent any time in the federal government, or I did spend a year, but a long time ago. But even so, we actually have much better bureaucrats than we deserve. By and large, officials in the federal government, they're paid much less than they could be making in the private sector, and a lot of them just do really good work because they believe in it, because they think they're doing something meaningful, or they did. I'm not sure, and that's one of the hidden costs that we're going to have right now.
So I actually do think that there's a lot of waste in the federal government, and I do think that there are a lot of things that the government does badly. I don't think the remedy for any of that is Doge. In fact, it is unfortunate because I feel like there could have been a real reform effort that did try to make government more efficient, that did try to reform the civil service, to have better rewards and better income for the civil servants who deserve the raises or whatever, and made it easier to get rid of people who were underperformers. I think all of that would actually be good. And I worry that that project has been completely undermined by what we've seen in the last couple of years. And this is not an original thought to me. There's this great organization called the Partnership for Public Service, that this is all they do. They try to work on ways to improve the civil service. They do a lot of these training programs. Historically, this is what they used to do. They're in trying to stop the apocalypse from happening now mode. But they used to do a lot of these training programs, and they'd come out with these lovely white papers about how to reform the grant-making process and civil servant and whatever, and recruiting. It is very difficult to get hired or historically it's been very difficult to get hired into the civil service. Now it's you just need to be the president's son-in-law, and then you can go negotiate peace with the Iranians. So it's a different world now. But I do think that there's a role for improving the administrative state. And I resent the idea, this binary that the Trumpers created, which is either you're in favor of Doge and the chainsaw and the hollowing out of all of this expertise, or you're in favor of the status quo. And that binary should not exist, but that's how a lot of this was framed, and I thought it was really unfortunate that Democrats sort of boxed themselves into sounding like they were defending the status quo, even though there are things that government could do better, definitely at the state and local level, but also at the federal level. And that whole effort, I think, is it's now it almost feels like a luxury to be talking about well, how can we reform the civil service to help people get raises? It's now just help them keep their jobs. There are much more basic things that we're fighting, that those of us who care about these institutions are trying to fight for now than the kinds of things we should be talking about. And we should be talking about ways to improve our statistical agencies and the methodology behind the unemployment rate or whatever. There are a bunch of things that could be made better that we're not talking about, because instead there's just the chainsaw and the wrecking ball and whatever other metaphor you want to use.
I'm sorry, but campaigning on a platform of improving our statistical agencies, I don't think you're going to find too many Democrats or
great bumper
Republicans
sticker,
who take that up.
Yeah.
Somewhere along the line, there was the proposed scientists' march to preserve science, and they would be chanting, "What do we want? Evidence-based policy. When do we want it? After peer review."
Exactly. I'm not saying this is the platform Democrats should necessarily run on, but there's some daylight between, like, either keep everything as it is, particularly in a political environment where people really do hate the establishment and they really do hate the institutions. And if you look like you are standing for the status quo, that's not going to be effective. So there has to have been some kind of reform message, maybe not getting into like the nitty-gritty of the technicalities of the, BLS methodologies or whatever, but like there has to have been some difference. And instead they kind of allowed the Doge movement to capture all of the dissatisfaction and energy around, like, just tear it all down, rather than figure out a way to build it differently. That it all got sucked into that all of that dissatisfaction and rage and distrust got sucked into a really destructive effort.
If I could shift the conversation a little bit and still maintain this thread, what is going to be the effect on government efficiency, on immigration, on jobs, employment, campaign finance of the development of artificial intelligence?
Oh, wow.
I mean, it's going to make things better, right?
It's all over the place. I mean, the part of the thing about artificial intelligence, just to say, is how new it still is. I mean, we're lots. I'm highly uncertain about it myself, in part because we just don't have. I mean, ChatGPT was unveiled, I guess, in 2022, and Claude the beginning of 2025, and so we really have a very short time horizon, and we still don't know how. It clearly has real uses, and I'm not letting Claude write my articles, but I am using it for some of the preliminary research, and people are definitely using it. It's not showing actually overall in productivity numbers, and how it will affect politics, democracy. Wow, probably badly, because in some ways, well, it's so easy to see how it can lead to reductive stuff, how easily it can be abused, but I don't know.
Well, I'll tell you what, one thing that, one impact it is having on politics is the growth of a small but extremely politically powerful number of AI tech bros who've made vast fortunes off this and who are setting up political action committees to pour money into the campaigns of friendly legislators, and who have already entree into the current administration and the clout to intimidate almost any federal bureaucrat who stands up to them. Does that bother you at all?
Well, no, that's the rise of oligarchy, but that actually began before AI. That's been happening, and these are, these handful of giant fortunes. Actually, one of the things that's really striking, if you look at the list, is that there actually are these are not new players for the most part. Look at the list. Look at the people, the famous shots of the tech bros on the podium with Trump at the inauguration. These are not young kids who started something in a garage 2 years ago. These are guys who made an enormous amount of money with these platforms 10 years ago, which they have then, to use the wonderful phrase, enshittified. But they still hold these monopoly positions, and that's a huge threat to democracy. It's a huge threat to everything, and it's also I have a thought that it is interesting that the people who are giving enormous amounts of money to MAGA, who are just playing such a huge role, are not recent innovators. They did something a while back. They're now middle-aged, and they used to be loved, and now they're largely hated, not even for political reasons. They're hated because everybody hates dealing with their platforms now. And I think that some of the craziness of U.S. politics is, in fact, the midlife crisis of the tech bros.
I see that a little bit differently. Maybe it's the midlife crisis. I don't know. They should all just.
I have more familiarity with that than you do.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I think it's also that they have more to lose. And I think part of the dynamic that gets a little bit lost in these conversations about the oligarchy is like who's controlling who. I think it's easy to think about the tech bros, the oligarchs, as protecting of controlling the president. But when I saw that video, I saw that iconic photo of the tech CEOs at the inauguration, to me, those did not look like people who were in charge, right? They were people who were terrified because this president, they already have a lot of money. Their companies already have a lot of power, and maybe they'll get more power and more money, but they could also lose a lot of it if Donald Trump has an errant tweet or whatever, Truth Social post that tells people to boycott it, or I don't know, has tariffs on all of the iPhones that are coming into this country. Like, do you think that the CEO of Apple went to the White House to watch the private screening of the Melania documentary because he was so into the artistry of this production? No, it's like he has to spend all of this time groveling before the president and sucking up to him in all sorts of different ways and talking about how great the Melania movie is and giving him these golden plaques and statues. Like, think about how many meetings must have been wasted at Apple coming up with, like, what's the right way to have the golden glass sculpture that, what's the thing that's going to appeal to him, rather than coming up with what should be the next new product or how do we, have more efficient manufacturing processes, like all the things that businesses should be focused on. Instead, they are focused on not pissing off the president and or sucking up to him. And so, I guess I just, the narrative is always about the tech bros control the president, but with very little effort on his part, he could destroy a lot of market capital, basically, and has, and frequently has. So I don't know how AI plays into all of this, but that's just how I see the interaction between these executives and our esteemed leader.
We've got some terrific questions from you guys out there, for which many thanks in advance. And one of them that caught my attention was guardrails on democracy, on the way this government works, have been shattered or disregarded. Is this the new normal? Do laws matter anymore?
Okay. Something that I think we've always known, if you thought about it, is that we talk about institutions. But institutions are just people. And if people don't take seriously the norms, the rules of the institutions, then it doesn't matter. And we reached a stage where we have a large, again, it's not across the board. There were not a lot of just the guardrails are gone during the Biden years. Right, the rules were obeyed, but we now have a political movement which is both willing to ignore all those rules and has enough clout, has enough devoted followers that it can get away with that. What happens afterwards? I guess there will be. There's going to be assume a Democratic sweep, and we have a Democratic control of Congress and the presidency after 2028. If not, I don't even want to think about that. But does the next Democratic administration? It certainly is going to follow a harder line. Somebody, under Obama, under Biden, there was a definite, let's let the past slide, and we're going to try to return to the old way of governing. And they'll certainly be a lot tougher this time around. Whether it will be anything like what's happening now, I doubt it, but the faith in institutions, the faith that the rules, I should obey the rules because everyone will, that's been very badly damaged. It's going to take generations to get back to that.
One thing that I think is interesting about the post-Watergate era is that it did inspire a lot of these reforms, some of which were pretty technical, some of which were not. to basically write down all of the things that that for a long time we thought were norms. Turns out they were not norms. They were not written down. We need to have the Budget Control and Impoundment Act to say when the president cannot spend money that Congress has ordered him to spend, just as an example. And there was really this reform movement that came out of it. It wasn't, I guess, exactly about rule of law per se, but it was about how do we harden our institutions against these kinds of abuses. And I am less confident that that is the mentality that we will come out of this era with. And one of the things that I'm very worried about is that rather than the collective lesson being let's redouble our efforts to make sure we have rule of law and functional institutions and things like that, there is increasing appetite from the populist left to have, I wouldn't say a symmetric, left-wing version of Trump, but a much more powerful executive of some kind who can knock things down. It's I don't know, Donald Trump was able to just knock down the East Wing. Why can't the president unilaterally forgive student debt or whatever? And I worry that we'll be sort of caught in this doom loop of hunger for more authoritarian figures, people who are, again, they're running on sort of the burn it all down. I'm gonna destroy all of the establishment figures who've been keeping you down. That there'll be more of a rhetorical focus and policy focus on sort of simplistic scapegoating, again, burn it all down type attitudes, as opposed to actually solving problems. And then you just end up like Argentina, where you have the right wing populists alternating with the left wing populists and back and forth. And I don't know, but it's boring to talk about technical solutions, and it doesn't, reforming our statistical agencies does not roll off the tongue. So I understand why the messaging may be more appealing, and you're seeing some of that happen in the Democratic Party right now. There's sort of a civil war happening over this, and that's one thing that I'm worried about.
Actually, I'm going to, at the risk of boring people, there's one area which happens to be my home field where you can see this has already happened, which is that international trade is one of the few areas where there really was for a long time a rules-based order, where it's not just that the United States had tariffs and exemptions from tariffs, but these were all the subject of international agreements. There were elaborate rules, and basically everything Trump has done on tariffs, aside from everything else you might say about it, is just violating solemn agreements made by the United States over the past really over the past 90 years, because this goes back to FDR, this whole system. Just a few years ago, a lot of people that I talked to, were we need to get back to the rules-based order. We need to get the World Trade Organization functioning again. We have to have the Articles of the GATT be the norms again. I don't know anybody who talks about that anymore. There's just a feeling that ship has sailed. We cannot reconstruct that system. We can look for something better, but the kind of and by the way, this was not. Sorry, I am digressing further and further here. But I was in the U.S. government for 1 year. This was the Reagan administration, which was not already some of what is happening, but there were interagency meetings where somebody would come up with some proposal, and the guy from the U.S. Trade Representative's office would say, that would be GATT illegal, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. End of discussion. In the Reagan years, you did not break our international agreements. That world is gone. I don't think we get it back.
So do you think if there were a Democratic administration, they would not follow those rules from the Lawyers Board?
If I were to go into, who's your into President AOC's office and say, I think that we should not do this thing that is polling well and is probably a good policy, but would be a violation of Article 22 of the GATT, I don't think I would want to make that argument.
Actually, the Biden administration undermined the rules-based system
they were
too
by
blocking a bunch of, again, this is way more in the weeds than you probably want, but blocking a bunch of the appellate judges at the WTO. So like they were undermining it too. Not nearly as badly, but I agree that there's just not a lot of appetite for like reconstructing these institutions.
Since you've raised the subject of the next presidential election, who do you think would be a good Democratic candidate?
I have absolutely no idea. I have no belief. I mean, I have to say, I mean, there are a lot of people I think are good people. If I were, I mean, on just plain cynical grounds, I would probably advise the Democrats to nominate a middle-aged white guy. I mean, let's just face it. We are not the country that after Obama's election we thought we were. I think we may well be the last advanced nation to have a female leader. I'm sorry, but that's I hope I'm wrong, but I wouldn't bet on it.
Speaking of politics and presidential politics and partisan politics and elections looming in the midterms in just a couple of months, are the Democrats making a big mistake by nominating so-called democratic socialists for Congress,
I wouldn't
local
say
offices, state
so-called
offices?
Democrats. I mean, a lot of them are self-identified democratic socialists.
That's true, you're right.
So it's not a pejorative term. It's like this is the organization they belong to. I do want to correct the narrative a little bit in that there have been a few democratic socialists or people who are sort of politically aligned with that political organization who have gotten a lot of attention. But actually, most of the Democrats who are doing well in primaries are like normies. They're they're like normie moderates. Roy Cooper in North Carolina doesn't get a lot of attention, but he's going to win. He's going to flip that seat. Mary Peltola in Alaska, the polling in Alaska is terrible because of a lot of challenges to polling there, but she looks like she has a pretty good chance of flipping that seat as well, and she's very moderate. She's running on a platform of like freedom, family, and fish, something like that. It's not culture war stuff. So I think that the drama is in places like Michigan, where there is obviously a lot of attention to I think Abdul Al-Sayed is not actually a DSA affiliate, but he has a lot of the same policy views. And he's a colorful character for a lot of other reasons as well, including some of the people he's had campaign with him. But there are a lot of these other places in Iowa. Josh Turek may flip a seat. He's, again, like pretty moderate. Because that's how you win in a place like Iowa, right? Potentially, if you're a Democrat. So there's a civil war going on. I don't discount that. But a lot of the more mainstream candidates who are doing really well are just not getting the same media coverage because they're not as colorful, because there isn't as much conflict there. And so I do think that distorts our view of what's happening in the party.
I'm a big fan of Elliot Morris, who's doing the Nate Silver type modeling without Nate's chip on his shoulder, and and he's first of all he says that the impact of political left or right on voting is much less than people imagine. Most voters just don't think that way, and for what it's worth, his Senate model says that by choosing El-Sayed rather than Haley, the Democrats reduced their chance of Senate control, I think, from 57 to 56%. It's just not nearly as big a factor as people imagine.
We've got about another 10 minutes left, so let me just ask you a few random questions. Thank you. They're not so random, by the way. They're from authorized members of this audience. Is Iran going to become Trump's Vietnam?
I mean, it's already. I mean, it's much more like his Iraq, right? I mean, the 2006 midterms were largely a referendum on the Iraq War, and Democrats won big, and it is amazing. I mean, no war in American history has started out this unpopular. And it's only gone downhill from there. And of course, it ties into the other stuff. The polling on Trump's approval on inflation is incredible. I mean, it's unbelievably negative, worse than it ever was under Biden. And Iran is certainly a part of that. I do think it is kind of a watershed moment because there were a lot of people saying, well, you may not like it, maybe he isn't all that democratic, but gets things done. And wow.
What those things are seems to matter a little tiny bit. On the question of will it be, I don't know exactly what it means to be his Vietnam. I will say that if you look at the polling of all of these other wars that we now think of as very unpopular, they started out very popular. And it took a little while, I think usually a few years, before the public turned. And what is remarkable about this conflict, this excursion, to use Trump's preferred euphemism, is that it started out very, very unpopular. So in that sense, it's maybe worse than Vietnam. Who knows?
Oh, and by the way, it's not just about the politics. I mean, this is still our country, and we want it to be able to defend itself and defend its interests. And this has been an absolute catastrophe strategically. We've burned up our stocks of precision munitions. We've demonstrated to the whole world that the U.S. military is not as effective as people thought it was. We've largely, it seems likely, ceded a large role in dominating the Middle East to Iran. We have, the cost to the United States has been unbelievable. I would not have thought, even I wouldn't have thought, that 6 months of idiocy could do this much damage to the United States.
Can the Supreme Court save us?
I didn't know this was a comedy routine.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I'm gonna, this is another, I think it's a line for, it's not exactly, but Lisa Graves, who has a very good book about the Roberts Court, and that it's kind of the Keyser-Söze moment. Roberts' greatest achievement was convincing people that he didn't exist, or at least wasn't the actual person he is. The court, this court is not on our side.
I would also not be surprised if Democrats in 2028 run on a platform of packing the court or something along those
it's
lines.
already
Yeah.
a proposal
Yeah.
that you're going to be, I think, seeing a lot of. Another interesting question, is capitalism compatible with democracy? In other words, are we learning from this administration that maybe it's not?
I don't think what we have now is a particularly capitalist presidency.
Really?
No. He's like taking stakes in private companies.
Hey, free enterprise at work.
He's putting up new barriers to trade. He is, trying to weaponize government. He's, to hurt his enemies and reward his friends, and oftentimes messing with the free market. I don't think this is a particularly pro-capitalist administration.
Well, and what is capitalism? I mean, what we have now is crony capitalism, maybe. But look, we had for 90 years or so, we had a system which was certainly markets were making most economic decisions, but with progressive taxation, unions, a whole lot of checks and balances that made it a less extreme, somewhat softened version. I don't think you would have said that the United States in 1955 was not capitalist, but it was, again, it was not exactly a democracy if your skin was the wrong color, but it was, there was certainly a lot of democracy. So, I mean, social democracy, the Democratic Socialists are mostly actually social democrats in the European sense.
So what's the difference?
What's right?
What's the difference?
A social democracy is basically capitalism with limits and some role for the public and enhanced bargaining power for people who aren't capitalists. It's the kind of mixed system which is mostly market-based, which is what all of us, even now, the United States is not fully capitalism red in tooth and claw, and it's also corrupt and crony capitalism. But that's a system. Look, it has unraveled a bit. We're in trouble now, but all systems do at some point. There's no reason to think that something like the system that worked for the United States and the entire rest of the advanced world for generations is an unworkable system.
I know you guys probably hate questions like this one, but if you could look ahead 20, 25 years, what kind of country do you think this will be?
I don't know if I could answer that question. I'd be a very rich woman. I know what my hopes are. Again, I hope that we recommit to rule of law and democracy and reform and making government work for people again. And my fears are that we're going to instead be sort of torn apart by the populist, sloppulist policies that'll lead to like throwing the bums out every 4 years, and the out party promising to solve all your problems by going after whoever the scapegoat is. Maybe it's the immigrants, maybe it's the foreigners, maybe it's the billionaires, whatever. That's my fear, but I'm working toward the rule of law one.
Yeah, I mean, I'm when I need to, get away from my day job, I do read a fair amount of dystopian science fiction, but I've been. But
How can you tell the difference?
Yeah,
No, but that's the point. Is I'm actually finding it hard to read those novels now, especially the ones from a few years ago, because they seem excessively optimistic.
I've actually taken to reading a lot of historical fiction, in part because there are other times when this country has been through a crucible of some kind. The World War II, the 60s. These are periods that I was not around for, but somehow we made it through. And talking to people who have been through those eras or reading about them, you get the sense that there were a lot of people who thought, like, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. We are fundamentally broken forever. And somehow we were not. And somehow we came through. And that's sort of my I don't know, one source of optimism for me, that it felt like a crisis before, and somehow society put itself back together. Same thing with the Civil War, right? Like somehow it was really, really destructive and really, really bad, but somehow we put ourselves back together. And that's my light reading.
Bravo. We can talk a little bit later because we got to empty the hall. I want to thank you all for coming. I'm not done with my thanks yet. And I want to, by the way, thank you for your excellent questions. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank Paul and Catherine tonight for one of the most penetrating, diverting, informative conversations I've been part of in my, 50, 60 years as a journalist. And I think if there's any bottom line here for me, it's that it was the Berkshire Eagle that brought us all together here. No, hear me out. I'm getting the hook here. The United States was formed. This country was launched in the pages of newspapers. All of our founding fathers made their views, their proposals, their dreams known in the pages of daily, weekly, monthly newspapers printed on newsprint, the way this one still does. I'm thrilled that you still appreciate the role that we play. I'm just bowled away by your generosity toward local journalism, and let's do this again.
Thank you, Don. People that are coming to the reception, just straight out the back door. There's the Shakespeare Garden is directly opposite the door. Those that are not, have a great evening. Thank you all for coming. It was a wonderful evening. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Todd. And thanks, Don. Be well. Safe trip.